We're all just jazzed about Termina getting more playable characters. Some are clearly in a better position for implementation than others, which we'll talk about. We're going to spend a little time talking about what could be, about how these NPCs could operate if they ever become playable. Let's just get right into it. In Fear and Hunger 2, we have 8 playable characters, but 14 contestants participating in the Festival of Termina. Most everyone is familiar with the core 8, as they are all recruitable, with some exceptions, in any non-masochism mode playthrough, so long as you haven't missed your opportunity to do so or taken a route that prevents their recruitment. A brief overview of our playable characters. Levi, the solitary soul, an ex-soldier deeply traumatized from his 5 years of service in the army, now relies heavily on heroin usage to cope. A former resident of Perheval, growing up in St. Domecq's orphanage, now a deserter, he has fled to the only home he has ever known. Marina, the Changeling soul, a young woman who was slated to walk the path of a dark priest of Almer due to the circumstances of her birth, but her mother intervened, granting her autonomy and freedom to control her own destiny. Still attracted to occultism, Marina has spent several years studying rites of old and new gods alike at the Vatican City. A letter from her father informing her of her mother's sudden death and warning her to stay away from her home in Perheval has left her puzzled and searching for answers. Daan, the blank soul, a man born to followers of Sylvain, he was left an orphan at a young age after his parents presumably succumbed to the tantric, all-encompassing effects of Sylvain's rituals. He was adopted by a well-off baron and learned of medicinal practice from him, as well as becoming engaged to the Baron's daughter. He was eventually drafted into the war, where he saw unspeakable horrors, letters from his wife-to-be keeping his sanity intact on the front, until one day they eventually stopped coming. When the kingdom of Rondon withdrew its troops, Daan rushed home to find that the Baron had killed his daughter and himself in a bizarre ritual. The only clue present being the mention of a town we know as Perheval. Abella, the caressing soul. A woman who had a relatively peaceful upbringing in Oldgard, the eldest of many siblings, she maintained a strong sense of responsibility and sought out ways to help those around her. This led to her contributions to her community through mechanics and engineering. Through her abrupt discovery of a wounded agent of Rondon, she came to know of the Nameless Liberty Underground, or the NLU, of which she became a member. The NLU lost contact with some of its members sent to investigate something big in Perheval, and Abella was sent to locate and assist them. Osa, the Enlightened soul. A yellow mage hailing from the lands of Ibissonia, he left his family behind to pursue knowledge and self-betterment, a goal sought after by the Yellow Mage sect of worshippers of Grogoroth. Osa joins a traveling band of these mages who seek something within the depths of the infamous dungeon of Fear and Hunger. While the group completely cracks under the pressure, Osa maintains his resolve and uncovers the still-living severed head of Nashra, terror of the eastern sanctuaries and master of the Yellow Mages. He informs Osa of the Festival of Termina and demands that Osa travel to Perheval and participate in the festival on his behalf. Olivia, the Shadowed Soul, a young woman who uses a wheelchair to move around, having some interesting effects on gameplay. She is a well-studied botanist, though she has always felt upstaged by her equally accomplished, able-bodied sister Rayla. Shortly after the sisters graduated from their respective studies, Olivia was informed through her family that her sister had been charged with treason against the Bremen Empire and imprisoned, only hearing later that she was freed by an alleged terrorist organization known as the NLU. Olivia seeks out information from Rayla's now deceased uni professor's documents and finds connections between the NLU and a town named Perheval. Olivia sets out on the first train there. Marcoh, the Tainted Soul, grew up as an orphaned street urchin in the Vatican City. Living a tough life trying to provide for himself and his sister, he always found himself in street fights. Through his sister's connection to a member of a crime family, Marcoh became a professional boxer, eventually coerced by the family to kill his opponent in the ring. The guilt was much to bear, and Marcoh sought to sever ties with the crime family, narrowly escaping, but certainly being looked for by men who wanted him dead. He took the first train out of Vatican City, headed to a town he had never heard of, known as Perheval. Karin, the Endless Soul, was born to an aristocratic family in the Bremen Empire. Always busy, Karin was primarily cared for by her nursemaid, Dahlia, who took something of a special interest in her. Circumstances within the Bremen Empire led to civil unrest, further agitated by legacy names amongst Bremen aristocracy. Karin's family was sold out. Common folk formed a mob headed for the family manor. Dahlia seizes this opportunity to kidnap Karin and leave for her home country, the Eastern Sanctuaries. Despite attempting to escape Dahlia as a child, she was unsuccessful, spending the remainder of her childhood under her care. Growing up here had Karin witnessing injustices committed by those in power firsthand, often enough to leave her with a strong distaste for authority. At a protest, Karin was assaulted by law enforcement. Waking up in a hospital, she was greeted by members of the Bremen embassy who had seen her protesting on television. Soon after, Karin was returned to her mother in Bremen, where she became a journalist. Greatly suspicious of the man known as Kaisar leading the Bremen army and learning of his being in Perheval, Karin sets off to get the scoop. Okay, so those are the playable 8 characters and their reasons for coming to Perheval, but what about the 6 remaining non-playable contestants? Well, let's start with Tanaka. Tanaka, the Latent Soul, a very drab, good-natured salaryman. His circumstances for being in Perheval feel the most coincidental, purely being there for the sake of his business. He serves as something of an unaware and unprepared character. He has the most varied amount of potential scripted deaths of any other contestant, as well as potentially being the first isolated, seemingly unarmed character if the player is looking to kill the other contestants quickly and make use of their souls. Speaking of his soul, it's very unique, offering no skills but a direct stat upgrade in every stat. Aside from agility to get that sweet 16 speed for extra turns, the Latent Soul might not seem as directly useful as the Tainted Soul, Suffocated Soul, the Enlightened Soul, or any of the god skills that you could be spending your soul stones on. That's because it isn't. The +1 agility is alright, but you can get that through God of Fear and Hunger anyway, which isn't difficult to build affinity toward or even bad investment, with the only other perfection circle god being Almer, whose Hexen skill tree is probably even worse than Tanaka's Latent Soul skill tree. Kind of getting ahead of myself here. Tanaka seems to be a fan favorite and quite popular due to his potential arc with Marcoh, where he learns how to defend himself and adopts a stoic, heroic persona. It's a very cool transformation, even further reflected in his moon-scorched form, Judgment. He truly becomes a very powerful being, speaking to his potential for growth and explaining the name of the Latent Soul. This is without a doubt our next playable character, but we have no idea how he'll function. While the Latent Soul being his primary may not be as detrimental as I initially suggested. Many characters can learn skills outside of their respective soul during character backstory. For Tanaka, I can see all talk skills being a potential choice, even something like diplomacy. Well, what if Tanaka's skill tree also added a bribery skill? Considering that killing Tanaka and his doppelganger is a fantastic way to make 40 shillings as it currently stands, I'm envisioning him starting with significantly more capital, something that would go hand in hand with a bribe skill. Now, obviously this might not be useful in most situations, but think of all the flavor text and interactions! Okay, but seriously, there are some enemies that I think would be willing to take a bribe, like Sojobs, basic villagers, hostile moon-scorched, nobody worth a damn really, but there could potentially be big uses for it that I'm failing to see now. Maybe a well-placed bribe could convince the general store owner guy to open up his fucking shop before day 2. In the first Fear and Hunger, Kahara the mercenary's backstory choices are all between utility and money, and as a consequence, the optimal way to build Kahara is purely for utility, never taking any of the options that grant you money. Well, that was more of a consequence of how money functions in the first game. It's much less useful than in Termina. Starting with fatter pockets in Termina, especially in masochism mode, is actually very hype, and not really something other characters can provide. This may be super overpowered, but maybe leaning into this even more could have Tanaka getting better rates from merchants as a passive skill, with relatively deep investment, or just as a starting choice. Maybe Tanaka doesn't need anything more than that. He's a simple guy, and it's difficult to justify him coming prepared in any way that isn't in the finances department. But let's move on. Henryk, the Suffocated soul. He's a chef. He loves food and is like way too into it, and that's his whole thing. He has a bit of a thing going for Abella and her apparent dump truck, and is eager to prove his usefulness to her. Unfortunately for him, that can't happen unless you're playing as Abella. Their routes are mutually exclusive, so if you trigger an interaction with one, the other will be moon-scorched the next time you see them. Speaking of moon-scorch, Henryk's is the only moon-scorched form contestant that can be reasoned with, which is interesting. You could argue Pocket Cat too, but that almost doesn't seem like Moonscorch, but maybe something else entirely, becoming a servant of Rare instead of simply succumbing to it, I suppose. The mare is a pretty simple fight anyway. I believe it's designed for players who haven't left Old Perheval yet, and only is somewhat challenging with the proper resources for the early game. Killing Henryk in either form will award you the Suffocated Soul, offering a skill tree that can nearly stand on its own as is, simply with how useful Master Chef is. Turning food into items that can buff your party is super strong. Melee proficiency isn't so bad itself for those riskier attacks, and even if slow metabolism isn't that useful with food supply being rampant throughout Perheval, it can simply be considered a necessary stepping stone to gain access to the superior skills. It should also be mentioned that saving Henryk will provide you with an unlimited food source for the majority of the game, which can be nice. He's really not the most interesting or even likable character at all, but he seems like he'd probably be easiest to implement. You could have a skill or two unique to bladed weapons that cause bleeding or some other status effect. Maybe he could learn a poison skill unique to the overworld that allows him to cook everyone poisoned food, one time at the train and one time at the Perheval Bop. Community member Afri has actually demonstrated what this could look like. Honestly, Daan should gain something similar in that case, considering that if you're playing him, you can't get the full mind heal cocktails that he prepares for everybody else. I don't think anyone would be that thrilled if Henryk became playable as opposed to some of his other NPC counterparts, but to say there isn't potential there is definitely not correct. Well, I think this game actually needs some weapon-based skills. As a chef, skills unique to bladed weapons could be very cool. Imagine a skill that attacks 2 random body parts for significantly lower damage, or a skill with a very high bleed proc chance. It's not very creative, but weapon skills are lacking in this game, and magic and accessory abuse is the meta. It would be nice to see some build variation, and maybe Henryk's skill tree is where we could see that. Well, moving on. August, the Tormented Soul. He's a very mysterious guy. We're pretty sure he hails from Old Guard, similarly to Abella, and last we saw a carrier of the Tormented Soul was the god of ultra-violence himself. He's one of the hardest contestants to pin down. You see him all over the place jumping across rooftops and shit. It's difficult to even find an opportunity to fight him as he's almost never within your reach. He'll never have much relevant to say if you do catch up to him, and encounters with him are very strange, such as his stopping you from killing the moonless beast and saying that she's an old family friend. Very curious. He's also clearly very powerful, as when you initiate a fight with him, he can simply decapitate you off a coin flip, if you don't just guard it. Other than that, he isn't too difficult of a fight and can be defeated about as easily as any other human contestant. Interestingly, he does not have a moon-scorched form, as he game ends himself on day 3 night to avoid such a fate. If he becomes playable/recruitable, that will likely have to change, as bringing party members to the tower does moonscorch them. Maybe to avoid this, he could refuse to go near the base of the tower, similarly to Marina refusing to go into the room with the mayor. He is much more aware of the situation than many of the other contestants are, after all. His moonscorched animation in itself could just be him game-ending himself before the moonscorch happens. Anyway, killing August will net you the Tormented Soul, which is somewhat limited in functionality. It's all kind of bad. Devour is pretty bad, as all it can do is restore hunger. I haven't used Bloodlust, but it takes a turn to get ready, which is already not a good sign in a game where that first turn really matters. Sisu is good in theory, but has the same problem in that it takes a whole turn, not to mention Hardened Heart exists, is a passive, really isn't that difficult to obtain, and doesn't require 4 soul stones to get. I feel that Warcry has potential with the Fluted Armor or Salmon Snake Ruin or something, but still a bit niche when your player character is the only person you really don't want getting hit. I don't even think the Tormented Soul is available in a Masochism playthrough. It isn't, and honestly, you wouldn't want to use it even if it was. If August was included as a playable character, it would be very cool from a lore perspective. We'd get to see the festival through a different lens and be privy to more information similarly to Osa. Not sure if he'd be able to climb the fence and have access to the rooftops. That'd be a cool Hexen skill though. As far as the rest of the skills, he could have a bow, meaning arrow crafting and the return of the real marksmanship skill. Lots of potential for cool stuff. I've seen lots of Termina fans saying they'd like to see him playable, and I'd have to agree that August would be a really great choice. Fingers crossed. Outside of using bows, I really do think it would be very cool if the player could actually make use of parkour or whatever the fuck August is doing, jumping across the rooftops. The sewer, blood portals, and golden gates all function as alternative ways to move across the map, while having access to the rooftops would give us yet another creative means of getting around and navigating Pre-Evil. I'm sure with its own dangers and enemies. Caligura, the Decrepit Soul, the resident bastard of the game. Caligura sucks. No redeeming qualities whatsoever. Just a vile, nasty man who is simply in this shit for himself. Playing as Marcoh is really the only way we can even figure out much about this guy. He's a mobster, a prominent member of a rival crime family, known himself as Count Dragul. Other than Pav, he's the only contestant actually killing other contestants. He will kill both Levi and Henryk if the player character chooses not to intervene. Despite all this, his human form is a huge pushover and can be killed easily. His soul is actually somewhat useful, with Intimidate working in conjunction with Diplomacy and generally having more effects on monsters than Persuade, even if those effects aren't necessarily positive most of the time. Steel can net the player plenty of extra supplies, explosives can make pipe bombs, which are pretty handy, and Killing Intent is good, but mostly as a player background skill for Marcoh, as by the time you've killed Caligura, weak enemies are typically not a concern anymore. I don't want to play Caligura at all personally. Him being recruitable would be cool so I could sacrifice his stupid ass to Grogoroth, but ultimately, I just don't see how he could be an effective player character. The man has the least amount of protagonist energy of anyone among the cast. I will say his skill tree is already pretty well built, and he could specialize in blunt weapon skills like Henryk could specialize in bladed skills. It would certainly be interesting to see him being played as a good guy as the player character, just to see him being hyper asshole on any other playthrough, but I just can't see it. Sorry. Samarie, the Radiating Soul. Samarie is simply the most underdeveloped contestant in the game. This is likely because most players will not reach her before she becomes moonscorched. She is meant to be a boss fight, clear and simple. Saving her is almost more like a little Easter egg than anything else, a chance to fight her while she's weak. Samarie is an obsessive stalker, the object of her obsession being Marina. She kills Marina's father because of this and freaks out, becoming moonscorched. It's really her whole thing. She seems to have gone to school with Marina, and as such is a capable occultist. Despite this, her Radiating Soul skill tree is quite barren, featuring only 2 skills, Blood Sacrifice, and the ever-hilarious Masturbation skill. Blood Sacrifice is useful for getting the most out of a Grogoroth sigil without sacrificing anyone, but strategically used necromancy-raised corpses can offer similar functionality. Masturbation, on the other hand, is actually quite useful and can draw extra affinity from any Sylvain sigil for no cost whatsoever. I fail to see how Samarie can be a compelling player character or how her being playable would contribute much outside of some extra background on her and Marina's story specifically, and her skill tree needs way more going on. There are some interesting things she could have though, like access to the back half of the cabin that she ominously peers at us from, maybe a blood portal connected from the train car to the church, available immediately. I actually think just making her recruitable would be entirely enough, as it doesn't make sense that she just wants to hang out at the train after saving her, even if Marina is out wandering the Preval streets alone or in your party. An odd suggestion I have for Samarie's skill tree is to actually double down on squeezing extra affinity out of every god sigil. Perhaps for Venushka you could lay various herbs on the sigil which could morph into something new. The quality of the created item could scale based on the amount of varied herbs you've placed. Not sure how this could actually work, but Rare could operate similar to Blood Sacrifice, but offering your character's mind up instead. The old gods take highest priority here, but the new gods could operate quite differently. Personally, I think this game is lacking in merchants. There are only 4 different merchants in Termina. This guy, Kiefer, that guy, and Pocket Cat. Well, what if Samarie offered skills that allowed further interaction with Fear and Hunger sigil and Almer sigil? With Mastery over Vermin, the player can hear the voices of rats taking shelter within the Funger statues. They have little trinkets for sale that could be different based on the location. However, using the statue to save will cause the rats to leave, disabling the merchant for the playthrough. I'm just spitballing here, but that really could add a layer of thought to Funger's Circle that isn't there at present. So my idea for Almer is much less solid, but would at least provide some fucking use for Almer affinity, so hear me out. Almer's skill tree is bunk, right? Worst shit in the game, by far. It's basically all just useless. But what if you could redeem Almer affinity as a currency at blood portals? Or, even more interesting, choose to redeem any god affinity as currency. I feel like this concept only works if the things provided in exchange for the affinity isn't as basic as items and the like, so why not direct stat upgrades? Say bye-bye to that useless Almer affinity and hello to an extra point in agility. It's a little out there, but it fits Termina, and it fits Samarie. Last but certainly not least, Pav, the Chaotic Soul. A lieutenant in the Bremen army, he has limited interactions with the player and isn't outright hostile, but acts as though killing us is something he eventually intends on doing. An altercation between Pav and Marcoh featuring Tanaka, if he hasn't died yet, will occur on day 2 morning, where you'll be forced to intervene and kill Pav or watch him shoot Marcoh and potentially Tanaka, if again, he hasn't died horribly yet. If you kill Pav here, Marcoh says something along the lines of, "I instigated it, sorry." So it seems like he's not actually looking to kill any of the other contestants, but isn't going to lose sleep over killing someone if provoked. This is even further developed on if the player reaches the base of the hollow tower before day 2 morning. Pav will be observed attempting to shoot and kill Kaisar, the king in yellow, his highest superior, revealing to both the player character and Kaisar that his only goal is to kill him, an act of vengeance in the works for his whole life up until that point. Then Kaisar fucks him up like it's nothing and walks away, leaving Pav to die on the ground in silence. With the player character's intervention, Pav can be bandaged and brought back to the train car, where he'll be responsive after 1 sleep session. He still manages to be standoffish despite your literally having saved his life, but he's willing to share what he knows of Kaisar, even if it isn't much. After Pav has been injured and brought back to the train, that will be where he resides for the remainder of the game. Similarly to August, Pav does not have a moon-scorched form. He will simply die from his injuries on day 3 night, every time. If Pav is killed at any point by the player character, they will receive the Chaotic Soul, which is admittedly pretty underwhelming. Bury the trauma, slowing the speed of mind drain in the overworld is alright. Unguard was pretty good in Fear and Hunger 1, but seems less useful in Termina, or more so just really buggy. Order Charge seems like it would be this crazy skill, but with the insane mind cost, it's pretty impractical and for not much payoff. One of few Hexen skills I'd put on a party member and not my main character. With some better Hexen skills and maybe a fresh perspective on Prehevel, the Bremen Army, Kaiser, and the other contestants, Playable Pav would be pretty fucking cool. My only suggestion for Chaotic Soul skills is the Point Blank Shot skill, which is an enemy skill used by Pav and a hostile ghoul soldier in Western Prehevel. Start combat with a random attack on a random body part with a decent chance to miss at the cost of a single bullet. Chance to miss can be remedied by having gun proficiency. It's simple, but it would be cool. So, of the 6 NPCs, that's, again, non-playable contestants, August and Pav are popular suggestions, but both lack a moon-scorched form. Caligura and Henryk both have a solid skill tree that need very few additions, yet they are generally unpopular, as they should be. And Samarie and Tanaka have very limiting skill trees and would likely depend on other characters' skills to round them out. Now, based on the Twitter poll Orange made, Tanaka is who we can expect for our next playable character, likely followed by Pav. As they have different issues, implementing them will require different solutions. Ultimately, it's all up to Orange. Nobody knows his own characters like he does, so I have faith that when we can finally play these characters, they'll be excellent as whatever Orange decides to include them as. It is worth mentioning that the next playable character will not be part of the coming update, but the one following it. I'm infinitely excited for the fishing minigame and the new area that are soon to be a part of Termina. Any new content for a game that already rules is a huge plus. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little brainstorm session. If you have cool ideas for any of Termina's contestants, be it an event between 2 characters, a Hexen skill, or a character backstory choice, feel free to share in the comments below. This is the obligatory part of the video where I scream at you to subscribe and follow me for more Fear and Hunger related content. Fucking see ya!